So the Jews now found themselves Polish citizens, but facing a very complicated situation. Many still reiterated their Polish patriotism, their joy at Polish independence, their determination to be good citizens. That did not overcome Polish suspicion. At the height of the Polish-Soviet War in 1920, as the Soviet army was about to take Warsaw, Jewish soldiers and officers in the Polish army were rounded up and interned in a special camp on suspicion that they might be collaborating with the Soviets. Now, once the wars died down and the situation stabilized by 1921, the anti-Jewish violence died down. The new Polish Constitution of 1921 promised that all Polish citizens would enjoy equal rights. All Polish citizens included 40% of the country's population who were not Polish. Only 60% of the population was Polish. This enormous minorities problem was complicated by the fact that the Poles bitterly resented being forced to sign a minorities treaty in which Poland promised to respect minority rights, schools, language, and so on. The Poles saw this as an insult to Polish honor, to Polish sovereignty, and they imputed this to Jewish lobbying at Versailles. Ironically, the minorities treaty would not be used by the Jews against Poland, but it would be used by the Germans and by the Ukrainians. The whole issue of Polish-Jewish relations was also complicated by the fact that Poland came out of World War I economically crippled, and one would even say devastated. The fighting had raged over the entire Polish territory. Railroads and the bridges were destroyed. Poland itself was now stitched together from regions that for over a century had been parts of other empires, where the roads and the railroads had been going in different directions. The industrial heart of Poland had been producing for the Russian markets. Those markets were now closed. The economy also suffered from the fact that the 1920s saw a collapse of commodities prices. So Poland's exports, mainly commodities and coal and grain, brought in very little money. For Poland to overcome hyperinflation and stabilize her currency, she had to accept foreign loans, which imposed drastic conditions on balancing the budget, which meant that Poland raised taxes on the urban classes, which the Jews saw as discriminating against them. In other words, we're dealing with an unholy mess. And whatever hope there was of economic prosperity or a restoration of prosperity was dashed by the advent of the Great Depression in 1929, which, hard as it is to believe, hit Poland even harder than the United States. The majority of the Polish population was peasants. And these peasants, for the most part, worked on tiny farms that were uneconomical. The great landed estates still existed, and in theory, they could have been broken up and given to the peasantry, but that really wouldn't have solved the basic structural problems facing Poland. And that led more and more Poles, more and more Polish leaders to say these millions and millions of Jews that we have, 3.5 million Jews, you know what? They got to go. They have to go so we can find jobs for Poles, so Polish peasants can leave the countryside and go into the cities, so we can establish a new Polish class of storekeepers and merchants, but these Jews have to go. And what that meant was that even though Poland was in fact, at least until 1926, a democracy, and even though Jews could vote, which they did with great alacrity, and even though Jews were very politically involved, being only 10% of the population, they didn't have the leverage to really defend their interests in the political system. And the fact is that the entire Polish political constellation, with the exception of the Polish Socialist Party, the PPS, saw the Jews as aliens with varying degrees of hostility. But there is a basic consensus that Jews were aliens. Yes, they're citizens. Yes, they enjoy basic rights, but we'll all be better off, including the Jews, if they pick up and leave. The great problem facing Polish Jewry now was, okay, how do we defend ourselves? And there were different political strategies. The first political strategy that dominated the early years of independent Poland was led by the Zionists, and especially the great Zionist leader Yitzhak Greenbaum. And Greenbaum's strategy was, we're not going to beg for our rights. We're not going to ask to be treated as equal citizens. We're going to pound the table and say, this is coming to us. You have to treat us as equals. And the only way, he believed, to really maximize leverage was to make a deal with the Ukrainians, the Germans, and the White Russians and form a minorities bloc of all the national minorities. And that would be 40% of the voters, and that just might be able to get things done in the Polish parliament that would protect Jews. Now, there were many Jews who were horrified by this. They said, what the hell in common do Jews have with Ukrainians or with Germans? But the minorities bloc was formed in 1922, and it was an amazing success. It won a great electoral victory, and at the end of 1922, with the help of the minorities bloc, a Polish president, Gabriel Narutowicz, with a reputation as being a liberal, was elected as president. A few days later, he was assassinated by a nationalist lunatic who said it is absolutely intolerable for the president of Poland to be elected by non-Poles. In theory, Poland was a democracy of all its citizens. In practice, as the assassination of Narutowicz showed, many Poles would not accept the notion that the minority should have a role in running the country. The minorities bloc then faded away. The economic problems of Polish Jewry became worse, with heavy, heavy taxation, which resulted in what I refer to as the fourth Aliyah, many middle-class Jews saying, we can't live here anymore, we have to go to Palestine. What I mean by that is the tax collector would say, you owe this, this, and this. This might be outrageous. If the Jew couldn't pay it, the Polish authorities would come with big wheelbarrows, big wagons, and take out your furniture. So that was known as Grabski's Agola, Grabski's wagon. And that led to this big immigration to Palestine, which raised its own problems. And then in 1926, Józef Pilsudski, Poland's great national hero, aghast at what he believed was the corruption of the parliamentary system, engineered a coup d'etat, overthrew the government, and seized power. And Pilsudski remained in control from May 1926 until his death in May 1935. Now we see another paradox, which is that by American standards, Pilsudski had done something that was illegal and undemocratic. From the point of view of the Jews, what Pilsudski did was terrific, because the democratic Poland, where the strongest party was the National Democrats, was strongly anti-Semitic. Pilsudski was what one might call an anti-Semite. That is, he didn't love Jews. He didn't go out of his way to actively help Jews, but he was a Pole from an older political tradition. He didn't see the Jews as aliens. He saw the Jews as part of the country, and he still believed in those old traditions of the Commonwealth, that there are many nations in Poland. He still had hopes that someday Ukraine and Lithuania might become part of some greater Polish federation. And Pilsudski believed that violence against Jews was impermissible and that nationalist agitation against Jews was un-Polish. So under Pilsudski, while the Jews still suffered economically, while they suffered from a great deal of discrimination in state and municipal employment, i.e., just as Israeli Arabs have a hard time getting jobs in the state sector, Jews had a very hard time getting jobs in the state sector. The fact is, though, that under Pilsudski, Jews felt protected. They felt more secure, and they felt that they were part of the country.